Okay, I think we're live here. This is our third Logic tutorial, Logic Pro X, and today we're going to focus on compression, which is one of the big three, along with EQ, which we did last time, compression, and finally reverb, which we'll cover in the next episode. So here we are, blinding white light. Oh my gosh, we've died and gone to Logic heaven. I'd like to create an audio track, please. Alright, so again, we're going to be working without sound within Logic, so we can just focus on the knowledge and the visual stuff. Let's full screen this bitch. Alright, so where to begin? We have this audio track. Let's do a brief little recording just to get some audio in there. La 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 la. Oh, it didn't record a lot, which means our gain is really low. This is an important side lesson. See how I just recorded this and the signal looks like so? It's pretty weak ass signal, is what that is. So you'd want to look at, this is sort of part of gain staging. The very first stage of gain staging is making sure that my signal comes in strong. And I was kind of like right up on the mic and, you know, singing with a fair amount of force, and this is all I got back for it, which means that the mic is really not getting enough. Ideally, you can always boost a signal afterwards, like in a multitude of ways. It's great to get it in a little better than this. Let's see if I play it. You can see down here, coming in at 13.4 at the loudest. That's, could be okay, but it's not great. So, Control Z. And I'm going to reach down into my box and turn a couple knobs and get things a little bit louder. How are we doing? Ooh. Ooh. Do better. How? Alright. Turn this knob a tiny bit. Alright. Let's try and record something new. La 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 la. There we go. That's a little fatter. Looks more reasonable. 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 So, this looks decent. Let's use it. I'm just gonna cut off this part we don't need. Put it here. Alrighty. You notice we're getting that thing that I mentioned in the first video where it like doesn't want to grab onto the place. So let's do a brief reminder tutorial on this whole grid thing. Snap is on, so I can turn snap off. Last time I referred to it as smart or something, but smart is the function of the snapping. So snap is off means I can smoothly drag it, as smooth as Logic allows me. If I turn snap on, now we have snap modes, and right now it's on smart, which tries to do sort of the best idea of what Logic thinks you might want. Then you can also select various divisions that go from bigger to smaller. So a bar is the biggest. You could have it snap to the bar, which means that's as smooth as I can make it. It's going to go from 1 to 2, no matter what. Pretty useless, frankly. Who the hell needs that? Beat. That's a beat. That's a beat. Also fairly useless because it's like, let's make it smaller. A division. Division can be a number of things, but I believe the way Logic works is whatever you see, whatever you're zoomed in enough to see, what they would consider a division. Let's try it. Yeah, so right now it's set to 16th note divisions, because this is a beat, and there's 4 of these in here, 4 beats in a measure, 16 divisions in a measure. If you're going off 16th notes, does that make sense? All right. So what we really trying to do, we're trying to drag this correctly. If you see right now, it's set to snap regions to relative values. This is a good example of this. It's slightly past the 3, and if I bring it back, it's going to snap a division back and be slightly past that division. So it's doing an exact 16th change. I think we've covered this enough since the second time. So what we should do is make this smart again. I generally use smart. And absolute value, which means, there we go, it's right on the 3. All right. Now we're going to loop with C, adjust our loop size. We really don't need this dead space, so let's make it even smaller. Okay, so we got this replaying, and we're going to compress it and see what happens, but we're not really going to hear what happens, we're just going to see it. So I'm going to pull open an EQ so we can see what's going on. What should happen is this wave should physically look different after we've compressed. So let's start from the beginning. There's really 2 ways to apply compression, and we haven't done a whole big mix window tutorial. Remember, X opens this mix window. You can do compression on a track, and remember, with the hardware, often each track would have a compressor like built in, perhaps, or not, or they could essentially attach it to the track with cables. So we can do that right here in our audio effects window. Keep in mind that order does matter. So we have an EQ open. I'm going to add, you go to dynamics for the logic stuff, because compression relates to dynamics. I mean, all this stuff kind of does, but dynamics refers to sort of changes in volume, getting louder, getting softer. What a compressor does is it evens things out, by reducing peaks, and sort of by consequence, often uplifting the non-peaks, giving you a more smooth signal. And just a little history on where compression really started. So they have all these sort of compression-like things. Let's just go to regular compressor. De-esser is a compressor, for instance, that works on a particular frequency, so it combines the function of an EQ, but a really specific part of it, which is the sibilance. So no matter what note you're singing, whether it's so or so, the s part of that is at the same frequency, and I forget exactly what it is. It doesn't really change even from person to person. That's that no matter what the vowels are and what the note is, you're going to get that in a high register. So what a de-esser, sort of getting into the weeds, but I think it's a good start actually. What a de-esser does is it compresses at that particular frequency, whereas our regular compressor doesn't really care too much about that. However, in a way we still are, because of what I said about the order. So we have this EQ open, which is acting on it, and we have a compressor, which is, by the way, already working. Let's turn it off for now. You see, if I turn it off here, it turns off here. So I can also turn it on or off here. This EQ is working first, which means the audio signal that's playing is going to go route through this EQ and then into the compressor. And there's often a debate in the mixing community as to whether you should be routing the compressor first or the EQ. It's totally a function of the scenario and what you're trying to achieve. I won't get into detail too much there. Usually, EQ comes first. Because what you're doing is, like, let's say, this would be a good reason why you'd want to have the EQ first. Let's say there's a bunch of mud down here, which there isn't really. But I'm cutting all this out. Then I hit the compressor. Now the compressor is not worried about this at all because I've already cut it out. If I do the compressor first, and I can literally switch order here. Then the compressor is acting on this information. The signal is hitting the compressor before it ever knows that you've reduced this. So let's say there's a bunch of mud and bump, and this can happen with a compressor where it's acting on things you don't really want it to act on. So let's say you have a vocal performance and there's a couple of parts that peak a little loud, and in general you want to smooth things out. But then there's also some noise that you just don't like. Well, the compressor, if that noise is loud enough, could act on the compressor and make the compressor do things. And remember, the compressor isn't really that smart. So if it's reducing the signal because of one thing, it might also be reducing other parts of the signal you like. So that's why it's great to sort of carve out what you do and don't like generally with an EQ first, and then have that go into a compressor. There are exceptions. We'll maybe cover that someday. Let's see what happens. So we have this compressor working. I'm going to put us in proper order again for what we're doing. Compressor is working, and we'll go into these knobs in a second, but let's see if I jack the threshold. Oh, just occurred to me. If we want to see what's going on here, we should have them in this order. Doge. Alright. So we've got the compressor, and we're going to see, hopefully visually, what's going on. What happens if I do this? -50. Interesting. So we have just an insane amount of compression working right now. The needle, when it's at 0, means the compressor is not acting at all. And if it's ever up, the compressor is currently active doing something. For it to just basically be sitting at -30 is out of this world insane. And I did that with the threshold and the ratio being super tight. What I'm not really seeing is any of that confirmed here. Really, this signal should be like barely happening. So it seems like the visual cue is not there. So I think, believe me, if you heard it, you'd hear just how suppressed all this is. My cat is trying to get in the room and he's scratching at the door, so I'll be right back. Hello, Rockman. Come in. Okay, so my cat, Rockman, is going to join us for the rest of the tutorial, perhaps. Good for other people to learn, and other cats to learn. So let's get rid of this EQ, since I don't really think it's doing a lot. And let's learn about this compressor. The first thing to learn about compression is that compressors have qualities inherent to them. And they all used to be hardware. It was a box. I have one. They're really fun. Turning knobs physically makes you think about what you're doing and not overdoing things. It's so easy to overdo things in the computer world because you can just kind of slap things all over the place, and it's like, who cares? When you're really turning knobs, it's like you're thinking about what's going to make it sound good. Compression started, I think, in radio. It wasn't really designed initially as like a way of making music sound better. It was a way to keep the signal in a radio broadcast from suddenly overloading and breaking all the equipment. So let's say you're like a disc jockey or something, or you're just calling a sports game over the radio, and then there's a big crash, you drop coffee or you yell too loud or something happens that's really loud. If you didn't have a compressor, all that volume, extra volume, would come through the radio, and people would be like, "Oh my god, that's like way too loud." Um, Point is that really, since the advent of sound coming through medium other than real life, radio, computer, TV, compressors have always been a part of that process, part of recording. You might say that a signal gets compressed a little bit, even just running it through a microphone. It's not a completely honest signal, especially with certain microphones. Compression kind of happens all over the place. It probably happens in real life in a way too. I kind of have a feeling that the human ear has a way of smoothing things out. But that's just a pet theory, isn't it, Rockman? All right. So with that in mind, this is modeled after a piece of hardware. We have shiny knobs. That's like, wow, cool, real knobs. But like those pieces of hardware, these software plugins have different qualities. So one of the first things that you might do is barely apply any compression at all and just try all 6 or 7 of them. Oops, 7 of these compressors, and they're based on, looks like real life models. This is platinum digital, which is what it's always going to start with, but you can select this one, you can select this one. Classic VCA. Notice how this one has a lot simpler of a setup. Get into that. Just like EQs, all these things work differently from each other. We got this one, looks a little wacky. I got this one. And then we got a vintage opto. So an opto compressor, I happen to know this. That's simulating a type of tube compressor. And let's see, mainly in compressing things, there's like 3 main ones. There's digital, which is this, all the digital stuff that's a software based version, and then 2 hardware ones. I think the main categories are analog and solid state. And solid state came along a little later in the late 60s. They started using them all the time, and it's like the 1176 is a Teletronics classic compressor that's solid state, that was used like constantly throughout the 60s, or rather the late 60s, the 70s, and the 80s, and to this day, really. Opto has to do with the way it literally uses like a photo sensor that gets all hot and bothered, and it's like the hotter it gets, the more it compresses, and then you set the amount of compression and all that based on how hot it gets. And so it's like very, very old school analog, and this is evidently trying to emulate that, which means some of the quality of just having this compressor might be that it's a little bit warmer and smoother. It necessarily won't have the same sort of attack times. This is in real life. Frankly, this computer thing, they can kind of do whatever they want, so they might try and emulate some of the warmth, but then also give it a really fast attack time. And I'll go into that stuff. Let's get into the knobs. Threshold. So right now, no matter what the hell else is going on, our threshold is at 0, which means the compressor is really not doing anything. The signal can go all the way up to 0, which remember is our peak volume, without being acted on by the compressor. If I turn this to -10, that means that any amount of signal over -10 will get compressed to some degree, which we'll go into. Right now, it looks like this volume is remaining below -10. Let's reset this. Well, so that's kind of funny, because we've got our signal coming in at -7.8. So you think it would be being acted on right now, but that's why it's kind of an inexact science. If we start turning this, it will. What is going on here? Ah, there we go. Took a little while. But it's coming in hard. Really hard. As soon as we go above the volume. So let's forget the numbers for now. Another thing to keep in mind. Let's take off auto attack and release. Great if you don't want to think about it, but I'm going to show you how to think about it, and it's great to think about it. Auto gain off. So the net effect of a compressor is that it's often reducing signals to a degree, just like an EQ kind of reduces the volume on particular frequencies or boosts them. A compressor is really designed to reduce volumes at certain places. So often you'll want to then boost the overall signal again, and that's what this makeup knob is for. So you turn down a part that's too loud, but then you turn up the whole thing, and then it's all a little bit louder and smoother, and that super loud part is relatively reduced. You may, it's all kind of like relative. You might reduce something and then bring the whole thing up so that reduced portion is back to its original volume, but everything else is sort of raised along with it, like a rising tide kind of a situation. When we bring the threshold down to a level where the compressor will act, it gets really jumpy. Like you can see this visually. It's like, whoa, 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 whoa. And you keep doing it, it's like, holy crap, thing is going nuts. That's largely due to this ratio, which is set at 30:1, which means for every 1 dB that goes over our threshold, remember the signal is what's determining that, the sound source. So if I turn up the volume on the signal, or reduce it, or turn it up, that will affect the signal going into this compressor. So that absolutely matters. If you change the volume, suddenly your compressor settings will act differently. Like let's say we've turned it up like this. We're compressing the hell out of it. Cool. But we can leave the threshold where it is and just take the volume all the way down. Oh, no, I'm learning something here. So it's sort of a signal thing, and I've kind of noticed this before, actually. So it's really based on signal. So this compressor is... what we're learning here is that this compressor is really acting before this volume. So I can bring this volume all the way down, and the signal is still being acted on. Good to know. So forget about that little thing I just said, but the concept applies here. When the signal is going over our threshold, which happens to be here, if it goes over by 1 dB, it's going to get slashed into 30 pieces, and you're only going to get one of them because of this ratio at 30:1. That is so incredibly harsh. It almost borders on limiting, which is kind of the ultimate compressor, and I think maybe even the first one. That's really what they were using in radio, is something that just says if the signal comes in over a certain point, cut its head off. A 30:1 is practically saying that. It's like almost in, you're getting 1/30th of the signal over the threshold. Something nice for vocals would be like a 2, a 3, a 4, maybe a 5, maybe an 8. If you really want to do some chopping. Just like EQ, the more you use something, the less natural a sound you're going to have, literally. You're changing the signal. So if it's a 3:1 instead of 30:1, that means for every dB that goes over our threshold, we're just going to chop it into 3 pieces and keep 1. So you're getting rid of 2/3 of the sound over the threshold. So if I have a volume or a vocal performance and most of it is below the threshold, then the compressor will not generally be doing anything at all. and when it goes over the threshold, the compressor will do a little bit of work. And that's kind of the art of compression. It's like, what do you want it to do? I could set the threshold closer to the top, which means the compressor will act less often, but then have a really harsh ratio, which means that when it does go over, it's going to get the hammer brought down on it. That's more for reducing peaks, really trying to accomplish something specific. If I want to get more of a smooth sound and just kind of generally even it out, maybe I'll bring the threshold down a bit so the compressor works more often and have a smaller ratio. Like 2 to 1, that's totally fine. Just cut the signal in half over a -20, which means it won't always be working, but it'll work to a certain degree. And that can do all sorts of things to the sound, just like EQ. Compressor can absolutely affect the color and the timbre of a sound, because often the transients, which is a word for the peak volume on a sound source, usually in the very beginning, like you'd have a harsh transient on a drum hit. You even have a pretty harsh transient on a guitar picking an acoustic instrument. You get that initial thwack, and then the sound is essentially just dying from there. A voice works a little differently. I can bring my volume in a way that has a different sort of transient. The way this thing acts on those transients is specific to the compressor design and the algorithms going into it, and then the way you turn the knobs. Let's get to attack and release, and this is kind of the magic of advanced compression. So you can do auto, but it's like they almost shouldn't have it, because you really should just learn how to do this and mean what you mean. Attack and release can do so much to change the character of your compression. So when the signal goes above -20, it's going to be acted on 2 to 1. But the question is, how fast is that going to happen? Is the sound going to go over -20 and then just immediately get clamped down on 2 to 1? If that's true, you have a very fast attack. And what's true is that a lot of these older, especially the more vintage tube compressors, were limited in how fast they could attack. The whole system, that mechanical system they had in place that acted as a compressor, took a little bit of time to kind of act. That was one of the things about solid state compressors that was so attractive to people when they came out, is that the attack could be a lot faster, which means that you can really clamp down on something quite effectively. If I put it like, I'm not an expert on what all these numbers mean. How do I mean to say that? It's like, do I know the difference what 250 sound like? Not exactly. It's like, sometimes it's better not to really look at the numbers at all and use your ears, because sometimes this is fine and sometimes this is fine, and you kind of have to know why you're doing it. It's tempting sometimes with like drums that are coming really hard to try and control them with the attack knob, so you get some really harsh transients on your snare or your even your kick or your hat or something, but really especially the snare will come in hard, and you'll be like, well, sort of in your own tunnel world, listening to the music, and kind of be focusing a little bit too hard on that drum and think, gosh, that's just a little harsh, like I'd rather smooth that out. So lowering the attack is a great way to do that, and it's also a great way to neuter your drums, and then you won't really be aware that your drums are just kind of lacking in oomph. It's not something you want to abuse. Good to let the drums come through, but maybe not too much. It's totally to taste. Moving on to release, even less used, I think, than attack, but also important. And I've seen this done with drums again as an example, where they had like a long release, And what a long release means is that after the compressor is acted on, it will take longer to return to normal. There's different reasons why you might want to do this, but the drum example that I watched on YouTube was pretty enlightening, because with a long release, he kind of transformed the sound of the drums. Like the cymbals sounded like they were sort of resounding much longer. The whole thing kind of just had a stretched out feel. Having a long release can be great on a bass guitar, for instance, where you often have a signal that sounds great at the attack point and it just kind of dies a little more than you'd really like. Keep in mind that even though compression is reducing volume, that combined with makeup and kind of the whole process, the way it works, it's not just reducing peak volumes. It's really bringing everything together and bringing up some of those lower volumes. So as that bass sound is dying, a longer release can actually mean that you're sort of uplifting it at the end, and you're saying, no, I want the beginning and the end of my bass sound to be more even. And then when I get the whole thing at the volume I want, the net effect is that it sounds longer and fuller and smoother. The knee has to do with the attack and ratio, I believe, and it's kind of like the curve of the action, and that is really something you don't generally need to get into, but maybe someday. Definitely want to understand attack, definitely want to understand release. I mean, it's as simple as, like, if you have something that, like, is getting compressed a fair amount, like this, right? We never even see it go back to zero. It never even gets there because the release is so long, the attack is so fast. The signal is always being compressed a little bit. We can see that here. Well, if I pull the attack all the way down, it's like it changes everything. You can see it barely works at all. Why? I mean, the settings up here are the same. The signal should be compressed, but the compressor is not able to act fast enough to actually do much of anything. So this attack is like super, super, super important. Not just a minor, smaller knob under these bigger knobs. Super, super important. They should have made the knobs the same size, because maybe the attack should be the biggest knob. It's that gosh darn important. This is kind of a side thing on this particular one. You can add an additional compressor. This is essentially a second compressor called a limiter. You can turn it on, and they have some other functions like distortion. Kind of cool. A limiter really is just a compressor that with a super, super high ratio, like higher than this. And you can limit individual tracks occasionally if you really feel like it. Like something generally sounds good, but there's just a couple of points where it's just too loud and you want to cut it off. Again, limiters, it's a good way to make something sound unnatural. But if you use them subtly, they can work. Another place that people put limiters most commonly really is the master bus, the stereo out channel. And that's just because you want the whole song not to clip above a certain point. And if you have your limiter too low, then it'll be working all the time and your music will sound squashed like a bug. The idea is to have the limiter do a little bit occasionally when necessary. The goal with mixing is always to make everything a little bit better. That's really it. And you have to weigh the pros and the cons. Sometimes you make a move and you're kind of like, well, that made everything a little better, and if you do too much of it, you're going to make some other things worse along with it. Sounds kind of general, but it's kind of like the Hippocratic Oath for doctors. First, do no harm, and that should be the goal of mixing. This compressor can do a lot of damage, just like an EQ, and you want to know that it's a tool. It's okay to use two compressors, so you might decide, well, the signal has some peaks that I don't need. This is just an example. This is a vocal signal, and not necessarily at all what I'd be doing for vocals. But let's put the threshold at -6, so we're just like, the thing can be pretty loud, but I just want to do a job that like cuts off stuff over that, like, because I really don't want it to be going over that, and I'll have an attack, you know, on the fairly fast side. But we don't need the release. We don't want to have the compressor being held on. So what this is doing is chopping off little top parts. Let's illustrate that with a lower threshold. You know, this is totally fine. Seeing the compressor work this much kind of makes me happy. All right. Let's get rid of this EQ and turn into another compressor. Let's do this one. This one has no knee. See, they've decided that you don't even need to fuck with the knee on this one. Fudge with the knee. Otherwise, pretty much the same we had before. Let's turn auto off. Let's turn auto gain off. That's dumb. We can make up ourselves. So we had that other one working. Now this one's going to do something completely different. Let's put it at -25. It's a ratio of 1.4, which means it's not doing a ton. And an attack that's not all that fast, and a release that, well, let's keep the release down, but you could have it hang on. Now, because of our threshold being so low, the compressor is being worked on a lot, or being worked, you know, all the time through the signal, but it's not doing as much. So even though this needle is up, we know that it's not going to change the sound source a ton. I think this video is going a little long, and I think we've covered just about everything. There's probably more general things on how you use compressors, and I think we'll do some more videos on, once I've covered reverb and maybe a couple other tools, we can start to work on like how you combine these things. But this is the basics on compression. Oh, one last thing to leave you looking forward. The sidechain button can get kind of exciting. Sidechaining is a technique I brought up, and we'll probably do a video specifically on that at some point, because it's a great technique to learn. You use a compressor to sidechain. All right, happy Tuesday, and I will see you later. Rockman says goodbye. All right, good night.